Okay, let's get started then. So welcome to this webinar on where we're going to talk about why your employee survey isn't working for you. That's quite a bold claim. We'll go into that kind of, bold claim as we go through the webinar today. I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Nick Court and Rob Robson from the People Experience Hub. So you know what, let's just get stuck straight in, guys. Let's come to both of you. Tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into this weird and wonderful world of employee engagement and employee experience. So Nick, I'm going to come to you first. And I know your voice, you've got a bit of a sore throat, so hopefully it will last the webinar hour we've got together.
That's brilliant, thank you. I've been told I sound like a pilot today. So yeah, so I'm Nick. I'm the CEO of the People Experience Hub, and I guess how did I get here? A few different things. My background was in Tesco, in Carlsberg, Associated British Foods, various different organisations, and looked after various different things: people analytics, colleague voice, etc., etc. And I didn't get here through kind of the usual route about engagement. I think I got here through industrial relations and HR technology, and wanting to do good work for people. So it was always a people-driven thing for me. So it was always about, my thing was about helping people be the best they can be. What does work get in the way of doing that? How does work enable it? How does it frustrate it? How can we solve that? So it was always about probably that background, because before I got into HR, I was a trade union official, and that was my route in, and so my route in was about the genuine belief that people should have a voice, and that voice should count, and that voice should be acted on. And I think that's where I came from, and I learned technology analytics on that route in. And the People Experience Hub was born in the back end of 2018, and 2019 we had a business. So that was it.
Amazing. It's always really fascinating to hear, how people kind of ended up in this profession, because I don't think there is a kind of a standard, career path, and we've all come from like lots of weird and wonderful places. So it's really interesting that you came in from that trade union side, and obviously have a shared passion with you about the fact that people absolutely need a voice at work, an authentic voice, which we'll talk about in a bit, is more than just a survey, right? But before we get into the People Experience Hub, we're big fans of the People Experience Hub, hugely impressed with the work you guys are doing. I think you're doing something quite different to a lot of survey providers, which is why we wanted to get you on today and talk about what you do. But before we come on to that, Rob, tell us a bit about yourself and how you ended up in this weird and wonderful world of engagement and experience.
So I've spent most of my career kind of in and around the people function, but without ever being a sort of really a dyed-in-the-wool HR professional. I would say, I did roles as a talent manager. I worked for sort of consultancies around change, transformation, OD, and I'm a chartered psychologist. And then when I was at Tata Technologies, and I was given the employee survey to do. So I experienced the joys of working with an unnamed global provider on that, and I actually went out to and actually it was a really difficult experience, a lot to do with difficult stakeholders and lack of real commitment and that sort of thing. But we went out to market to look at alternative providers, and actually Nick came along with a very early version of what became the People Experience Hub. So this would be 2017. And I said, you're not ready yet for us, but we got on well. And then, we sort of, when I left in 2018, and we started doing some stuff together. And my first response when Nick invited me to get involved as an advisor was, does the world really need another, survey provider, employee survey provider? And he convinced me that it needed a better one. So I thought that was good. And then kind of towards the end of 2020, in the pandemic, we decided to join forces, and here we are.
Amazing. That really resonates, Rob, because as you know, I have a background in psychology as well. And when I made the move, I started my career as an academic lecturing in psychology. And when I made the move into the corporate world in 1998, the reason I got the job was because they gave me the survey. You said they gave you the survey. I was given the survey. It was 1998, working for, it was Seaboard Energy, then became EDF Energy. And they're like, we want to do this kind of survey thing. And because of your background, you could probably do that. And I'm like, oh yeah, no problem. And my background was in health psychology and wellbeing. So it felt like a natural fit. But exactly like you, I mean, I spent 10 years in-house and had the joy / pain of looking after the survey. And I started off being really enthusiastic about it. I'm a psychologist, I'm a research psychologist. I love data, I love research, and really quickly kind of lost the love for it. And I thought, you know what, this whole job that I do, whatever we call it, employee engagement for experience, should be all about helping people to be their best selves at work and helping them to thrive. And I spent hours upon hours in a darkened room arguing about reporting hierarchies so that we can make sure the right person's got the right report. I thought we've lost our way on this. What started off as a really valid, genuine way of, helping us to understand where our people are at and what we need to do to make things better, kind of got overtaken by this billion-dollar industry of big companies doing all the wrong things. So I think I really that's probably part of the reason that you and I and Nick really resonated initially, because I think we had quite a sort of similar experience, and I know you have a passion for doing something different in people experience. So let's just talk a little bit about that before we go into sort of the detail then.
Yeah, sure. I've jumped in. Nick is probably in many respects the best person to talk about this because he started the company. But I'll seeing as I've started, I'll pick it up and
I'm interested to hear what you're going to say.
I think it's my experience of working with a big supplier in the space was it's just an implementation job. You get given your questions, you get to tinker a little bit around the edges, and the reports come out, and nobody really knows what it's about, because even I didn't really know what it was about, even though I was a psychologist and I was kind of responsible for it, because I had no skin in the game. I wasn't involved in design. I wasn't, it was just was what it was. It was quite transactional. And I know that one of the things that, that's one of the things that Nick's always talks about is the lack of flexibility. And that's one of the key principles that we sort of founded ourselves on. I know that Nick's much more into the tech side of it, and part of it is about doing stuff that actually has good sort of future-proof tech, which is again flexible, easy to use, the user experience being really important as well. And then we'll talk a bit more about some of the stuff that we think makes us different, kind of as we go through through the journey, because we want to, when it comes to that, we want to start at the beginning and kind of take you through that. But anything to add to that, Nick?
I think it's about intentions, right? And it's about what do you. I'm going to circle back. We employ some people, and our clients employ lots of people, right? And what is our job in this whole thing? So we have to be intentional in our outcome, and we have to be intentional in our design. And you've got to have great tech, but let's be honest. You can go and ask anybody how they're feeling about something. You can go and talk to people in multiple different ways. There's so many different ways to listen to people that we've been convinced somewhere down the line that this is a tech play, that this is a technology field, that employee engagement is about technology companies, and it's the technology companies that have convinced us of that. So my first call out to the world is, if this is about outcomes for your people, then it has to be about people, and your intention has to be about that people. The technology should be the best vehicle it can be for that. So the things that drive me are about accessibility, about inclusive technology, about technology breaking down barriers and enabling voice. And I think we were really lucky that we started a business, during the time when we could think about what we wanted it to be, rather than saying, let's grow a tech company that will sell in 5 years' time. And I think that's the thing. Our intention is to help organizations understand their people, to improve people outcomes for themselves and their people. And I think it's driven by that. Look to the intention and understand then how did you build your organization to fulfill that intention. And I hope what we've done is built an organization that reflects those positive thoughts. I'm an old hippie though, so like, you know, you have to bear that in mind as well.
Love that. Yeah, that again, that all really resonates. And you know, for years, People Lab, you know, we talk about trying to help companies move from transactional to transformational engagement. And I've got this one slide. It's not a great slide in terms of design. It uses terrible clip art, but it really resonates with people. It's that kind of classic transactional approach where, you know, you think, oh, I've got to do something about engagement. You're not really sure what that means. So you think, okay, I'll do a survey because it gives you that sense of I'm doing something. And as I said, I'm a big fan of data and surveys, being a psychologist, but that kind of in the past, that whole approach of like, we'll do a survey, we'll take the bottom 3 things, we'll try and fix them. Or action plan used to be in a spreadsheet back in the day. Now it's more Wizzy Tech. And then we'll forget about it until it comes around again. And I know that that People Experience Hub is not in that place at all. You're much more about transformational engagement, about making it part of the overall offer. So today's session was really talking about, you know, why your survey isn't working for you. So why don't we start at the beginning, as you said, Rob, and just talk about, you know, some of the key kind of pitfalls that people fall into when they're thinking about or they're using a survey. So let's start at the beginning. Where would you start in terms of reasons why a survey isn't working for people?
Yeah, we kind of alluded to it already, which is it's really about understanding why are you doing the survey. Obvious question. Having a strategy, having an understanding of why you're doing it, what you want to get from the survey, what are those people outcomes that you know that are important to you, and how does it fit into what you're trying to achieve in terms of your employee experience or employee engagement strategy, your people strategy. And so it's fundamentally about that question of why I'm being strategic. And I you know, when I said it was a painful experience doing the survey in my role at Tata, it was in part because I inherited it. It was already going to happen, and I realized quite quickly it wasn't an awful lot of commitment to it from the senior exec, and that made the whole process really difficult, right down to getting actions signed off and all that sort of stuff. And I realized there and then that it was an HR initiative that didn't have buy-in, it didn't fit in anywhere. There wasn't that strategic perspective, not only to where it fit within the people strategy, but that strategic buy-in, stakeholder, that senior stakeholder buy-in to why is this actually important for us? So it's really all about sound like Simon Sinek, but it's starting with the why and working from there. But if you can't, answer why am I doing this? What do I want to get from it? The rest of it is just going through the motions.
Yeah.
And you only get so much from it. You'll get something from it, don't get me wrong, if you do everything right, but you'll only get so much from it.
Absolutely. You've got anything you wanted to add to that, Nick, or is it?
I grew up in the cash poor world of retail, and if you couldn't answer the why, you didn't get the money. And if you couldn't show that there was a 300 times return on investment, then you didn't get the money. So, having that why in place was always super important. And I think, and I know we're going to talk about some of this stuff a little bit later, but it's already that if you can't answer the why, you can't answer the what next. And if you can't answer the what next, you can't answer the how are we going to do the what next. And you can't talk about the journey to the outcome, the journey to the intentional place we want to get to from this. What's the data we're missing? What's the activity we're doing? If you can't answer those questions, then you can't even get into the how. So I do think that the why, if it's missing, is hard work, and I'd almost say there's plenty of ways to spend money, And if you can't answer the why, then maybe there's a better way to spend that cash to help your people feel listened to or engaged, or to just make their world a bit better. So I'd almost go that procurement piece starts with why. And internally, I'd love to think that organizations have persuaded internally that we've released the cash because we're clear on the why.
Yeah.
And it's not so. Oh, sorry, Emma, but it's not even that, if you know what you're trying to achieve, you know the why. It might not even be a survey. You do, and it's of course we believe in the benefits of a good survey, right? Because we're a survey company. But your strategy, your listening strategy, your employee voice strategy, whatever you want to call it, might not include surveys.
Absolutely. So you mentioned before, Rob, about when you were at, I think it was Tata, able to tinker around the edges of the survey design. Now, I know survey design is something that People Experience Hub it's a big part of what you do and what you offer, right? That ability to really think about what you're asking and why you're asking those questions. So again, something that I feel really passionate about is survey design. I know we've had lots of conversations about this. So let's talk about that. How do you approach that, and what sort of mistakes are people making at the moment with the survey design, or maybe even lack of survey design? Any thoughts on that?
I'd take a step back from I think there are other things that come before survey design, but let's talk about survey design. I think the single biggest mistake that people make is they just take what they're given.
Yeah, definitely.
Some nodding.
Yeah.
Maybe there's like 12 questions to unknit an organization that you could have or something.
Yeah. Regardless of whether they're right or not for our organization. I hear you. We talk about this all the time. Yeah.
And then so once you get over that, there are other things you want to think about. We would say have a framework in mind, a framework for understanding what you are trying to measure. Doesn't have to be perfect. There's a lot of talk about validity and reliability and psychometrics and stuff, but the same principles don't fully apply with employee surveys. But understand what you're trying to measure, understand why you're trying to measure it, and think about a framework before we get into what kind of framework and stuff, because we have one. But a framework will help you analyze your results so much more effectively, make sense of them, and that gap from making sense of results to action is the bit that managers in general find so difficult. So to be able to go out and tell the story later, having a framework is a starting point as well. It doesn't have to be the perfect framework, but having a framework is important.
There's the who as well, isn't it? I mean, who's answering these questions? How are they answering those questions? When you're designing that survey, I think you've got your why in place, what the outcomes are I'm looking for, what I'm looking to get from doing this piece of work, and then you've got to think about who's taking part. And I think this is where alluding to inaccessible technology, neurodiverse people, people with physical disabilities, how are they going to take part in a survey, and how are you going to design that survey? So designing the survey has to be about that mix of questions and methodology. And I'm not an organizational psychologist, but I'm a guy with thumbs and a phone, and I think about how I use those to take part in surveys. But the conversations that Rob and I have a lot are, what's good research and what does that look like? What's what has some validity? Is it a 4-point scale, 2-point scale, 5, 7, 10, 100? And how do we get to the right thing for us on those questions? And then I kind of try and take that into that. Well, how do you then design that survey in terms of the technology? So, anyone who, if you read enough of the stuff I've shared, you'll know that, if a survey has a slider in it, So you're designing a survey and you decided to put a slider in it. I'm very anti that. That is bad survey design. You're excluding people. You're excluding people who can't take part in your survey. You are capturing false negatives. You are, people move to the next question and the slider is already recording a zero. A zero through. I think the best one I saw was a very famous HR director talking at an EX event, who said how amazing it was to see a wilted flower on one side of the scale, and when you slid it along, the flower stood tall, and bloomed. And it was like, how can you measure engagement? And they said it's far more interactive. They talk about gamifying. So I think design is, there's the two elements, isn't it? There's how do they participate, and then the question design as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about who, you're also very passionate about the accessibility part of that, color blindness, dyslexic fonts and things like that. But there's a whole design piece before you even get to question, and that relates to that does relate to the tech. There's certain things you should expect from your technology in terms of design, in terms of accessibility, in terms of UX, and using some best practice in terms of things like use of scales and all that sort of stuff. But then, of course, there is the question design, and that is, it's not rocket science, but there is some science behind it. It's sometimes I get a bit, what's uncomfortable when you talk too much about science in this stuff, because we're not doing science. We're applying science. We're applying some principles that have come from research and all that sort of stuff. But it is important to have that sense of structure. And so it's probably a good point to talk a little bit about the framework. Just as an example.
Go for it. That'd be really interesting to hear about the framework.
So let me find this on my screen. Seamless, almost. Can you see what you
can see that? Yes. Talking points.
So there you go.
Yes.
So what we call PX3 is our framework, and it's a very simple framework in its heart. And I realized when I came into the business and Nick asked me to start thinking about, what is our framework going to be, because clients were asking him, was that I realized that there's very old fashioned surveys that just measure a bunch of things. There's more recent types of survey which are commonplace, which is where it'll be your engagement survey, whereas you've got a bunch of things and engagement, and if you're lucky you'll get some drivers of engagement, and that's fine, that's great. But there's a couple of things that I noticed. One is that wherever you look in sort of in psychology, in communications, even in the way that psychology is applied, you sort of kind of see these three levels all over the place. And I was a little bit surprised to not see anything like this in the survey world. And so we separate out the perceived environment. This is what I observe, this is what I notice, this is what I perceive, from this is how I feel about it, then this is what I would do as a result of it. And so those are the three levels. So on the perceived environment is things like leadership and management, communication, processes, all that sort of stuff, teamwork, collaboration. Then in the middle, what we call the felt experience, we tend to focus on autonomy, belonging, connection, enjoyment, growth, and purpose. And these are very much related to human needs. They're quite closely related, shall we say, to self-determination theory. But
absolutely, yeah.
I didn't want to use three. I just thought I wanted to go a bit more granular than that. And then we in this framework, it says, it doesn't have to be those six things. We can actually look at other elements of things that are felt experiences. So you might, things like confidence, for example, trust is a big topic in its own right. And emotion, I mean, obviously emotion is very broad, right? So we've only got one square in there, which is about emotion. But for the first time, we actually did emotions in, with a client recently in felt experience, and that was an experiment for us, because it needs to be the right organization, the right sort of culture to do that sort of thing in the first place. And then we talk about, and then it's outcomes, and we start with the outcomes. So as we were talking about earlier on, it's really about engagement. Isn't everything. Engagement is actually quite a narrow concept, really. In motivational terms, it's basically enthusiasm and commitment, and and emotional commitment to the organization. And actually, there are different types of ways that you might want people to, with a small e, engage with the organization. and it might be that you want them to be more innovative. It might be that you want that well-being might be the lens that you look through, look through for your outcomes, change readiness, etc., etc. So we kind of encourage our clients to think a little bit beyond just, it doesn't have to be engagement. You might need an engagement score, and that might be your whole reason when you talk about the why. That might be why you're running a survey in the first place, because you've been told we have to put an engagement score in our survey report. Okay, well, if that's your starting point, at least you might think about other ways you can get other things you can get from your survey other than just a score. But that's the framework we use, and that informs our design. And then you start, and really it becomes a conversation about what is important to you as an organization right now. What is what kind of outcomes are you looking for? Which of these things feels relevant for you right now? We'll take reference from things like values, from if somebody has a culture book, if somebody has a published EVP, and we'll kind of try and marry this up to what they're doing. And sometimes the stuff on the left-hand side is we dial it up, and sometimes dial it down, and sometimes sometimes the client will say, actually, I don't want to measure that at all right now, because we know that it's going to be crap, and there's no point in wasting questions on it, because we know where we are, and we've even we've gone completely different with a couple of clients. We had a client that, for example, said, I like kind of interested in these questions, but what I'd really like to do is group them. Where have we got a culture of performance, and where have we got a culture of inclusion? And in terms of building those themes or indices, we built it differently like that. So, but the basic framework is those three levels. And we'll come back later to why we do that in terms of analysis. It allows us to do a kind of a predictive analysis and tell the story a bit differently. But then, so that's what drives the questions. I'm going to stop sharing just now. Then you've got other things you've got to think about, is like designing for a whole organization. Sometimes really, really huge organizations will say, actually, we'll have some questions, they want some questions for different sort of staff groupings and that sort of stuff. But for the most part, you're designing for one organization, from the shop floor to the top floor. So it's the language is important. It's got to relate to people. The length of the survey then becomes important as well. Are we going to keep, sort of cognitively, are we going to, is this going to be manageable for everybody who takes the survey? Have they got a history of trust? If you've got no history of trust, then a really long survey, very quickly people are going to start talking about it and saying, well, it's really long. Don't bother with it, all that sort of stuff. So you've got to think about all that with design. There's a whole, it's very sort of holistic thing. And when, people just, people are some people are very purist and go, yes, you've got to understand, you've got to be measuring a construct, and it's got to be valid and reliable and all that sort of stuff. And you go, well, okay, let's talk about what does validity mean in this environment. So there's that. And then you've got, what's a good question? The anatomy of a good question, and it's things like not being too long, not being long enough so it makes sense, not being too long, using sort of plain language, not using not asking double questions, all that sort of stuff. So design is so broad, from the visuals that Nick was talking about, which seems like about 20 minutes ago, through to the almost like the political social context of the organization, through to more technical bits around what makes a question. So it's a very broad and interesting kind of topic.
It is. I can, obviously, again, relate to so much of that. I think there's a couple of things sort of buzzing around my head. I think on the one hand, this question about, psychometrics, reliable, valid constructs, etc. And we know there's not a single universal, reliable, valid definition of engagement. So how the hell can you have a single measurement of it? And there's obviously Schaffelli and Baker's work engagement scale, which is a reliable and valid scale, but it's engagement with the work that I do rather than engagement at work. So, go back to what we said about the why, for me, I always come back to, why are we doing this, and what do we mean by engagement here? And I think there's a massive debate. I think it derails us slightly about, it's an outdated concept, it hasn't worked. And I'm just like, well, if we use it as shorthand as practitioners, I think it's really useful, because we all know what we mean by that. We could talk about meditation, we could talk about, as psychologists, when we talk about well-being, we would talk about what the layperson would understand as happiness, whereas when the layperson talks about well-being, they're probably talking about health and well-being. There's lots going on there, but I think that engagement as shorthand is useful for practitioners, as long as when you're inside an organization, you take some time to really explore what you want that to mean, and to your, undercut your framework. It's really useful to sort of say, well, what do we mean by engagement? Which of these constructs sit underneath that? So I think that's a really useful conversation to have. But on the flip side, I wonder if the practice of whether we call it engagement, whether we call it OD, whether we call it experience, it is not technically valued in outside organizations. So lots of very well-meaning, very well-intentioned kind of HR people, generalists, are given this to do, and they haven't really got the necessary, they haven't got the training in the background to really understand, as you said, how to develop a decent question. Like you and I as psychologists, not that I'm not being big or clever here, but we know that you don't ask two things in one question. We learned that in year one doing a psychology degree, but why would someone else know that? They've not studied it. So I think we're kind of in the mess we're in because people have been given the survey who don't really get it. I don't know what you think about that and how we overcome some of that.
I think I've got a view on that, and I know Rob's probably got a better view, or a different better view. But mine's been really simple, which is like, the thing that was really helpful for me was calling the third area outcomes and not engagement.
Yeah, totally.
And then you can have a conversation with somebody, about what are the outcomes you're looking for. What does good behavior look like to you? What does an engaged employee look like? And you can have conversations about this being about outcomes, positive outcomes.
Yeah. And
what drives that. And the one thing I noticed when we talked about outcomes, particularly with C-suite CFOs, CEOs, was removing the nebulous concept of engagement was helpful for the conversation at the C-suite. Because we were talking about, how do you drive an outcome? What are the drivers of an outcome? What frustrates an outcome? What enables an outcome? When people feel like this is the type of outcome that can occur. And they got a lot more on board with drivers of an outcome. But actually, when we were dealing with practitioners, the concept of engagement was important, the concept of engagement, because it is so bedded in. And I think you have to be able to have the conversation about both things.
Yeah.
And I have no issues talking about engagement. And I know there's a lot of people out there who will say, what is engagement? It is nebulous. It has no definition. I'm like, I know what engagement is. I know when I feel engaged. I know when I'm disengaged. I know when I'm not. Engagement has a definition, but for some reason we apply that to the workplace, and all of a sudden, it's become this huge debate. And the debate gets in the way of doing, the debate gets in the way of moving forward. And there are people using the fact that, engagement comes across as a engagement with hyphens around it as a reason to distract from it or detract from it. And, you know, or to say it's not scientific in its background, or there isn't some science that sits behind it, or some research that sits behind it. And I think to myself, are they being playful? Are they trying to undermine something? Because why wouldn't you want well people in your organization? Why wouldn't you want innovative people? Why wouldn't you want people ready for change, productive, motivated, advocates of what you do and your products? Why wouldn't you want all of that stuff? And if you don't want to call it engagement, don't call it engagement. And if you want to call it engagement, call it engagement. I'm super cool with all of that, you know. And I just think this is about grassroots language and the mix. But again, that's my views. Helpful to call it something different at a C-suite for sure.
Yeah. We could spend hours talking about engagement, couldn't we? But you know, it's never resolve it fully. But
totally. And I think you've summed it up beautifully, Nick, and I absolutely 100% agree with all of that. So let's move it on then to like the execution piece. So you've designed your survey, you've followed your sort of top tips there, you've got your framework, you've really thought about how the question design works, you thought about the inclusivity of different, I hate the word audiences, but we know what we mean. Again, just useful shorthand, your different audience groups inside your organization, what's going to work for them. So what comes next?
Do you want to have a go, John?
I'll have a go.
I'm just jumping in.
I'll have a go. It's fine. I mean, immediately you've got to start thinking about that deployment piece, haven't you? So you've designed the survey, you've got everything going, and you know who your audience is. And I think there's a few things here, which is, you know, we are looking, ultimately, we've put all this effort in. We haven't put this effort in for 20 people out of 1,000 to tell us what they think. We're looking for a good representative sample of people to take part. So you have to think about channels. You have to think about, how am I communicating this? How am I communicating the why that we talked about before? We know that line managers are so influential. You know, we're that first line management group that is the first line of management that an employee will see. They've got to get the messaging right. They've got to believe in it themselves. On, you know, taking people on the journey, you know, line management can make or break good participation, as can good deployment and good communication, you know, the timing of the communication. And I think, you know, not everyone is sitting at a desk waiting for a survey to come through. You know, some people are sitting at a desk and not waiting for a survey to come through because they're busy, and some people don't have a desk, and away they are. So you have to, and again, it's intentional. You have to be intentional about solving those problems. So what happens if somebody hasn't got a work email address? How are you going to reach them? What if somebody cannot take part because of their environment they're in? Prison guards. So a great example we've had before is prison guards. Prison guards are not allowed to take mobile phones onto the work premises. Yeah, they're not allowed to have access to that technology. So how do you reach somebody who doesn't have the technology? So I think when you start thinking about deployment, you have to start thinking about all of that stuff. And we hear a lot more these days, the trust side of it. So how do you go out and talk to 1,000 people, 10,000 people, and persuade them that this is it confidential or is it anonymous? I think people use them interchangeably. If it's one of those things, why, how does that work? But you've asked me to enter my employee number, so you must know it was me. You know, all of that stuff that you've got to overcome, which ultimately is around trust. And, you know, Rob, I know you've got some good thinking about that, intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation, what's great. And that's probably where I sit back, you know, because I'm a roll your sleeves up deployer, and I'll sit back now and listen to Rob talking about building that trust.
I think, I mean, often one of the questions that often comes up is, you know, how voluntary should it be? Should participation be? Should we incentivize people? And I think one of the challenges when you do get line managers involved and tell them how important it is, that then they start going, right, you need to do the survey. And it has to, and it's this delicate balance that it has to feel voluntary. It has to feel important but voluntary. Even incentivizing people to take part has its risks, as you'll appreciate. If you incentivize people to do something that they would do anyway, then at some point they may become less likely to do it. And especially if you then take those incentives away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so. I think it's about communicating how important it is to the organization, emphasizing that you will take action, and this is where that process of building that trust over time it becomes quite important. You first time you do it, you might get a little take up. If people see action, there's nothing better than seeing action to then build that confidence that something that it's valuable use of my time, and all that sort of stuff. And we, one of the things that we use with clients is the COM-B model, which is what Professor Susan Mickey's come out of health psychology, and it's capability, opportunity, and motivation drives behavior. And in sort of detective terms, it's means, motive, and opportunity. Give people the means, encourage them, give them the motivation, help them understand why it's important, and remove barriers. And that's where the deskless piece comes in. QR codes on posters, and sometimes that removing of barriers can blur the line then to the voluntary, involuntary. We've had clients that have sort of kind of walked groups of people off the line to go and do their survey, and then, but it is still voluntary. We're going to be standing here in this room with computers. So it's really, that can be really challenging. That can be really challenging. But addressing concerns, addressing fears, like Nick said, what's happening with my personal data, being open and transparent about all that stuff is really important.
I think I just want to say, because I love this, right? And I grew up doing different stuff, and the first time Rob told me about COM-B, and he wrote a blog about it, and I read the blog, and it's like I was literally that. I was that walking GIF. I was that emoji, that mind blown emoji, and I'm sitting there going, I'm like, I can see this. If someone has the capability, they have the opportunity, they have them. Oh my goodness, of course they can do that. And Rob was like, yeah, well, it's for exercise, it's for any behavioral outcome that you're looking for. And I'm like, oh, even better. And I want to know, like, this is what I want to know. Is like, why isn't this out in the world? Why isn't every HR person going, when we're looking at behaviors, whether that is participation in a survey, whether that is, voting on the new trade union, voting on pay rises, whatever it is, why are we not talking about part of COM-B? Because do they have the capability? Yes, no, they don't. Okay, how do we overcome the parts of the capability they don't have? Do they have the opportunity? No, they don't, because of the work environment or because of something else. How do we overcome the opportunity? Do they have the motivation to do this? Yes, they do, or no, they don't. And if they don't, what do we do to overcome that? What can we learn? How do we learn from people that do have the motivation? And I just think to myself, like, I was a project manager for years back in the day, implementing IT systems. And I just think to myself, like, if I knew about this then, it's HR systems, if I knew about this then, my world would have been different, because I would have gone into Hinckley Distribution Centre and gone, this isn't a capability problem. This isn't an opportunity problem. This is a motivation problem.
Absolutely.
And I would go in thinking about what I need to solve. So this stuff, like, and the reason I'm getting animated about it and taking all your podcast time and all this time up is because I just think, like, we can talk about survey design, we can talk about this stuff, but when you get to this is hearts and minds. Yeah.
Oh, it is. Yeah.
Game changer.
Yeah, I totally agree. And again, this is probably a whole other kind of expert insights episode. I have a massive frustration with the gap between the world of academia and the world of business. And when I first went from academia to the corporate world, I was shocked at some of the outdated kind of ideas and methods and models that are still being used today. And I won't go on about them now, but I was like, what, you still think that works? Because we dropped that in psychology like 30 years ago. Why are you still doing that?
Yeah.
Why do you still think if you give someone a perk, they'll be motivated, you know, all that sort of stuff. Anyway, so we could do a whole other experts insights on the psychology we know actually at the moment anyway today works. So I'm conscious of time. I really want to get onto the, I guess, the holy grail, right, of survey design is that insights to action piece. And I think for me, that is where the biggest opportunity is for organizations to actually, you know, do something with their insights. And I see so many failing to do it, do some kind of very transactional kind of, you know, tick box stuff with a few things that wasn't quite working from the survey, and then they go, that's it, done. So, and I know you've got some really interesting and really, you know, powerful ideas around it. So talk to us about insights to action then.
Yeah, it's so important, because as you know, when no action is taken, people become cynical and start to see it as a waste of time, and it can even create disengagement. And there's also research I was looking at recently, because we're actually doing a grant application to do some AI to take managers from insight to action. And we found that this paper that basically said that, you know, managers that took action with their team and involved the people in that got, I think it was 27% higher engagement scores than those that had not, that, you know, so the next time it was done, basically. And I think it was 9% on retention as well. And so we know action is important, but it is a difficult gap to straddle. And again, it's another passion of Nick's, because when it comes to, you know, people analytics and usability and accessibility around charting and data. And I have to say I've learned huge amounts from Nick about all that sort of stuff. But so that first step is making the results easy to access, making them very clear. And it's amazing how, given the amount of sort of good technology in this area, how often the results aren't made clear and aren't made accessible and all that sort of stuff. But it sounds like an obvious thing to say. Then there's the and I'd separate this presentation of results from the analysis of results in that sense. And how do you interpret them? And I think when, you know, we were talking earlier about our framework and how we go to those 3 levels. You know, that what we see is out there is, like, in the more popular, you know, bigger players, you'll get your drivers of engagement. And that's fine. You've got to make a bit of a leap to which of these. There's 2 things. One is you've got to make a bit of a leap to, well, which one of these is actually the priority, because it's not just the most influential. And then there's also some fairly dubious statistical stuff that goes on sometimes, which is, you know, you just get a list of drivers that it's pure correlation. Yeah,
they're not drivers now, which is it? That's not drivers.
No, you know, and you get a correlation matrix, and so these are all high, but which is, you know, some are, you know, consumption of ice cream in the summer goes up. You know, that's a reasonable correlation. Consumption of cheese goes up in the summer. That might be something else entirely, and that's what we sort of see in some of the drivers analysis. But what we do, I'll share the screen briefly. Like I've never done this before. Where's the button gone? Oh, it's right, that green one right in front of me.
Right, green. Yes.
You can do this, Rob.
Yeah, I can do it. So there. Right. So what we do is we produce, from that 3-level analysis, we produce 2 different kind of analyses in amongst all the results and things like that. The first one is on the left-hand side, is the path analysis.
Oh, you're not showing it, Rob.
Yeah, we're not seeing
the
slide. No, I think we see slide 5 maybe.
Oh,
Stat slide.
oh, well,
You can see
okay.
your other screen. I think it's your other screen you need to share.
Let me start. This is me and technology.
Happens to us all.
Yeah, I've got it's because I've got two versions open of the same thing.
There we
Boom.
Can you
go.
see it?
Yeah,
Yeah, there we go.
yeah.
So on the left-hand side, we do the path analysis, which shows the flow from the perceived experience through the felt experience to the outcome. So that says what is engaging your people and how is it engaging them, and that how is quite an important question. If you're in that role of, you know, expert, SME, etc., you're in the EX world, you're, you know, a specialist. That's interesting if you're in that world. So this is something we share with the team, the team that's actually running the survey, and that helps them tell the story. You know, when your line manager supports you, what we see is you feel that you're growing, you feel that you're getting a sense of belonging and purpose, and you're more engaged. Maybe more specific, and you're more likely to say you're going to be here in 12 months' time. We see that story developing, and that's really useful for the people that want to tell that story, want to justify the initiatives that they're doing, all that sort of stuff. We don't share that with everybody because, quite frankly, it can look like spaghetti. So it takes quite a lot of explaining. But what we do is kind of make more widely available is the driver's analysis. But what we then do is we plot the score for those drivers against the influence. And it's just a very simple thing that says, okay, you then end up with key strengths, key focus areas where you really need to take action, opportunities, and strengths. And these are all, when we do this analysis, everything on the page, it has a relationship. So at this point, we run what we call it's what's called a path analysis or a mediation analysis, which is it's a regression on a regression sort of thing. For those that are vaguely interested in stats.
I am.
And so what we're saying is what a regression tells you versus a correlation is this group of variables predicts, you know, together predicts your outcome, and it's the most reliable group, you know, most reliable set of predictors. And so, but we can say to people, right, look, go these things, these questions, these items in your key focus areas, go straight to them, do something about them. And that takes you miles away from the high and low scoring questions that you mentioned at the beginning. It takes you away from even just having to look down the list of your drivers and go, well, which ones are scoring higher and which ones are scoring lower? And it just makes it so much more digestible. And it takes you straight into that discussion about action. And it's really, you know, and we find that's really helpful. And again, that's a simple enough analysis. I'll stop sharing that. So yeah, go on.
I think as well on this, not everyone's an analyst, right? Not everyone is consuming data in that way. So you've asked, I don't know, you've asked 20, 30, 40 questions, whatever you've asked some questions. And, you know, we all know how biases kick in. So what happens when we have too much information? We either go to the thing that confirms our own belief, we go to the thing that we recognize most, we go to the easiest, you know, we apply the easiest logic, and the easiest logic is that high-low performing. So it's the lowest score, therefore let's tackle that. And you've got, say, let's say you're a hospitality business, and you've got a front of house manager who's running the site. They've got so much to do. No, they didn't sign up to solve engagement or solve retention. They signed up to run a restaurant, and they've got compliance, and they've got food, they've got staff, they've got cash, they've got customers, they've got health and safety, they've got all this stuff to do. And then somebody says, oh, and by the way, also here's your engagement score results. What are they going to do? It's not just the engagement survey that has too much information. Their world has too much information. So you're giving them more on top of more. So what they do is they tackle those low scoring questions. They go, I'll go where the easiest win is. And what I love about this is what we're saying to people is, if you can't do everything, do these 4 things. If this is the outcome you're looking, then go here. But don't forget to celebrate the things you're doing well that are highly influential. You're scoring high on these things. Celebrate. And people forget in a survey when they're taking action to celebrate and to celebrate what's happening. And I guess the only other thing for me is when I see somebody say to me, our survey results show that people who feel they belong are more likely to be engaged, or, you know, people who enjoy their work are more likely to be engaged. I go, you didn't need to spend any money to know that.
How's that help?
Okay, that's great. You know, that's a driver of engagement is belonging. You know, who knew? You know, and it's more, there's more to it than that. And I think that's it. It's taking something complex, turning it into something consumable by people who aren't analysts, people who don't talk about employee engagement, people who just want to get on with their job, but they genuinely want to help their people. The thing that Rob said, the line managers who take action. Tell me where to take action and I will. Show me what will have the biggest impact and I'll go there. Yeah.
And I'm really conscious I'm itching because Lauren asked a question.
Yes, thank you. Let's clean that up.
So we must talk about that. And we should,
anyway.
So is this thing about how do you handle the mix? There are going to be strategic things that come out of your survey. And I think that is why you'd run it. For me, that we wouldn't talk about which surveys to choose, because there's a whole debate about pulse, annual, etc. The whole reason for running an annual survey really is that it gives you that more strategic view of the organization. It gives you the whole picture. It gives you that insight. It gives you that more depth. So the strategic piece is important. The big benefit from it. But why not let people loose on those short-term those quick fixes, the low-hanging fruit, because it takes time to digest those strategic those strategic actions. It takes time to get them signed off. I can tell you it can take a long time to get those things signed off, and by the time they can get those things signed off, it can almost be forgotten as to why you were doing it in the first place. So that those quick wins build momentum, and people and give and I think it's really valuable from that point of view. So it's not an either or thing for me, as is top down versus bottom up. For some organizations, they just want to start with top down because they haven't got a history of running this through the whole organization. They just want to get to grips with it first time. I completely understand that. But I think encouraging managers, encouraging both at the organizational level and down into the organization, just start having conversations with your team. Just start doing something. Just take action. Get on with it. Don't wait for permission, kind of stuff. There will be some things that they focus on the things that you can control, obviously. But yeah, so I definitely an advocate for both, the short-term quick wins and the strategic. While you're thinking about the strategic stuff, getting the agreement, just crack on, really.
Yeah, I absolutely, totally agree with everything you've said. And I'm just conscious of time. And I as you know, I could talk surveys and research and this stuff. I'm a massive nerd about it. However, I'm sure other people have got other things they need to get to. So massive thank you to you both. I think it's a really interesting conversation. And I guess I'm a little bit surprised that we're not further forward with this, because I know the three of us have been talking separately about this stuff for many years, and I still have a massive frustration that we see many organizations kind of doing it the wrong way. So I guess my kind of final question, just before we finish, is what do we do to kind of cause a shift here? How do we start to really take this forward? Obviously, other than people coming to you to use your product, what else can we do to kind of really help practitioners to kind of make this shift and get more out of their survey and do things the right way?
For me, there is that it's just encouraging people to engage. I think the whole stuff, what you're doing with getting people to think more about the employee experience and to become more engaged in it all as professionals, is just all kind of a helpful shift in the right direction to get people to think more, question more. And I think for me the biggest thing is don't just accept that what you're told. Be a critical thinker, because that's a whole starting point. That says, okay, I want to know why I'm doing this. I want to know that it's going to have benefit. I want to know that it's going to help me achieve certain outcomes. But then also then it's going to drive my sort of, that critical thinking about the provider. Then if I'm clear about that, then it's going to drive me to be more critical and questioning of the providers that I start talking to, and it just flows through the whole process. So just that whole bit about critical thinking, I think, is important.
Yeah, I love that.
And just encouraging that in general, and getting people to think more inquisitively about the employee experience is a good thing.
Definitely. And we talk about one of our principles being curiosity. So absolutely on board with that. Nick, any final comments or thoughts from you before we finish up?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective is, I think people have to be a bit gentle around this stuff. This has been an industry in its making for many, many years, and sometimes the biggest marketing budget is the one that wins. And what we see, we know, and what we know, we do. And I think that when that's the case, the frustration that you could feel by the world not going quicker can eat you up. And I think then it can either frustrate you to the point that it's what's the point. And it's like anything, it's about chipping away small bits. It's about carving out your niche, but it's also about, and which is one of the things I don't think anyone's really done before, is going, where does that sit within a general persona or a maturity level? Maturity not being a childish thing, but being that maturity approach, but saying, what are those channels of communication, channels of education? How do we educate somebody who is a HR manager, has been a HR manager for many years in a company of 400 or 500 people? What does that look like versus what does that look like for somebody of a global organization? Sometimes their thinking may be exactly the same. Sometimes one person's more advanced along that maturity scale than others. So I think the first thing is going, if you want to change the world and you recognize that there's a problem in the industry we do, I think the first thing is about going, who and how, because one size does not fit all. And I think that's really important. And I think be gentle with the people that you're talking to, because they've been on a journey, and be gentle with yourself, because you're not going to solve this overnight. And I keep having to tell myself that, otherwise I would be a huge frustrated mess.
And I think that is just brilliant advice to finish up on. Sorry, Rob, you're going to say one last thing.
I mean, that be gentle thing, we've seen it before, haven't we, with things like the debate around things like Myers-Briggs and things like, if you tell people it's rubbish all the time, they start to get resentful.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely.
And they'll dig in.
Yeah. And
you don't really win arguments by telling people what they're doing is a load of old tosh.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's really good advice. Chip away at it, be gentle. And just, as a positive psychologist, I'm all about sort of saying, hey, there's an even better way to do this. But anyway, thank you so much, both of you. Really appreciate your time. Really interesting session. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for
having us.
Cheers.
Okay, bye.